Okay, folks, we are beginning lesson 17 tonight, and which means there's only one more lesson to go in our study on angels, Satan, and demons. Um, the class next week will be kind of a wrap up, as you'll see when we get towards the end of this. We're going to look at New Testament scriptures that deal with this issue in Genesis chapter 6. But for tonight, we're going to go back and kind of do I don't even know if we'll call it a review, just kind of mention some of the things we've looked at. Most of this was covered already, so I'm not going to spend time reteaching it. Also, uh, there were handouts that were given to the folks that were in the class. So uh, we've been dealing with this fallen angel view. And as you can see by the check marks, we've covered most everything, at least the first three uh, um, questions that I wanted to ask about this. Tonight, we're going to look at that fourth bullet point, but just very quickly, just to kind of give us all a review of where we're at tonight, where we've come from. We spent time talking about this word Nephilim, and mentioned the fact that it is a transliteration of the Hebrew word Nephal, and it means fall, fallen ones, and those that fall upon others. That's the basic definition. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, that's that second comment. Most scholars translate this word Nephilim as fallen ones, and so we kind of followed that trail. And what we did, I think the last time, now it's been 3 weeks since we met, so just have to keep that in mind as we go forward. Um, we talked about translations, and we talked about translations because within the translations, that's where we come up with a lot of problem issues. And we went all the ways back to the Septuagint, which is abbreviated the LXX. Mentioned the fact that the Greeks wanted to read the Hebrew Bible in their own language. And so around 200 BC, they commissioned 70 scribes to translate the Hebrew Bible, what we call our Old Testament, into the Greek language, and that became known as the Septuagint. Well, starting with the Septuagint, they within the Greek language, and again, this is just review. We've covered this already. Starting there, and then moving forward about 600 years or so, we have the Bible being translated into the Latin, which was the language of the Roman Empire at this time. And Jerome is the fellow that translates the Hebrew and the Greek into Latin. It becomes known as the Latin Vulgate, and you can see on the date on the screen around 400 AD or so. That translation also had an issue with this word Nephilim. Finally, we get to our early English translations, and probably the King James is where it all culminates in around 1611. All these translations up on the screen, as important as they were and as accurate as they were for the most part, they continued to translate the Hebrew word Nephilim in Genesis 6:4. They kept translating that word to giants. And so that's where our issues come into play. When we talk about this word Nephilim, immediately people want to talk about giant people everywhere and all this sort of stuff. Um, we took some time also the last time we were together looking at Numbers 13, looking at First Samuel 17 and Second Samuel 21. And we saw from those passages, tried to bring this out, that there's actually a different Hebrew word that can be translated as giants, but that word is not Nephilim. That word is not Nephilim. The Hebrew word Nephilim does not mean giant in the sense that we're dealing with big or huge people, individuals that are 20, 30, 40 feet. Again, depending on, who you're looking at, who you're reading. There's a lot of really odd stuff out there. So Nephilim is really not a good word to use as far as giants is concerned. Keep in mind, it actually means fallen ones, and that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with angels, fallen angels who cohabited with human women and produced this race of Nephilim. So, although we may not be talking about people that are as big as our power poles, uh, we also need to understand that the Nephilim were not Barney Fife individuals. In other words, they they weren't meek and mild. In Genesis 6, they're actually they're called mighty men. They're called men of renown. Also, that terminology is used of a man that will show up in chapter 10 of Genesis by the name of Nimrod. And if you read chapter 10 of Genesis, that's the chapter where we have the Tower of Babel or Babel, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So, this man Nimrod was, a man of renown. He was a mighty warrior of some kind. Same language that's used of these Nephilim there in Genesis chapter 6. In his commentary on the book of Genesis, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who I've quoted multiple times in our series, says this. He says that this intermarriage produced a grotesque race that was superhuman both in mentality and in physicality as far as their strength goes. But he adds that not necessarily in size. So maybe they were large, maybe they were, anyone over 6 foot to me is a tall individual. So, when we talk about even some of our basketball players nowadays that are over 7 feet, we saw something just recently where, and it's documented, a man back in the 1940s grew to nearly 9 foot in height. Was a genetic issue, and he just kept on growing. So these were probably the size of the giants, like Goliath and Goliath's brothers. Um, Not necessarily, and I know some people want to label them Nephilim. They weren't. They were just giants of some type. So we need to keep that in mind. Another thing, when we talk about these Nephilim, another commentator says this. He says that they were powerful individuals, probably military leaders, the Nephilim. The Net Study Bible, in its notes, states that mighty men means warriors, mighty among men, and heroes. It goes on to state that the text refers to superhuman beings who held the world in their power and who lived on in ancient lore outside the Bible. In other words, what the Net Bible stating at the end of that note is that um, because of their renown, they lived on in the Greek and the Roman gods, and that's where we have the demigods and the Hercules, those type of individuals, half god, half humans. So what I'm trying to do is just make the case here for this idea of Nephilim here in Genesis chapter 6, of meaning just what it does. They were fallen individuals. They were powerful, absolutely. They were mighty in strength, but they weren't necessarily as tall as power poles. Let's put it that way. I think what we're probably going to do is move on. A lot more could be said. there's a lot of interesting folklore out there, I guess we could say, concerning the Nephilim, but you just need to be careful where you're getting your information and making sure it's credible, because there's a lot of bad information floating around out there on the internet. What I want to do is I want to move us along to the next bullet, and that's the one with the arrow. What was Satan's strategy for using fallen angels to corrupt the human race? What was his strategy? What was behind that? Now you got to remember, these are demons, and their master, their leader is Satan, and they're only going to do what he says. So why did he do this? Why did he command this? Um, we need to kind of take a step back from Genesis chapter 6. And actually, we're probably going to take a look at Genesis chapter 3, because that's where the fall takes place. But what I want to concentrate on for just a few minutes is talking about his attempt, Satan's attempt at stopping the seed of the woman from coming into the world, stopping the seed of the woman from coming into the world. And we'll expand on that in a few minutes. But we need to go back to Genesis chapter 3, which we've already studied in depth, so we're not going to go back and reteach it. But one of the things we found out concerning the fall of mankind in Genesis chapter 3, and starts in verse 1, is that creature that is labeled a serpent. Again, depending on your translation, my up on the screen is a New American Standard. But this is what God says through his word about this creature. He says, now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field which the Lord God had made. I emphasize that idea that it's God made the serpent. There's nothing wrong with the serpent. He was one of God's creations. It's that Satan used this serpent to bring down mankind through temptation. So keep that in mind. Again, we've looked at all this before. Other translations, the NASB says crafty. Other translations say cunning or shrewdest or even subtle when they refer to this beast of the field. Everything kind of falls apart around verse 7 of Genesis chapter 3, where we actually read. Let me get there real quick. Concerning the fall of mankind. Starting in verse 6, I have verse 7 up there, but starting in verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She gave also to her husband, and he ate it. And now verse 7 says, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves covering. So immediately we see the results of the sin that or the deception that Satan used to cause them to sin. And as my first bullet says there, they died instantly. They died instantly spiritually. Spiritually, they didn't fall over dead. Their spirit had died, and it's going to take many years um, for God to continue working with man to show him, and that's where we're headed to with verse 15 of chapter 3, that he's going to send someone into the world to alleviate this issue, this problem. The instant that man disobeyed God, he lost his spiritual life and severed his direct line of communication with his maker. Man received a nature that is self-centered now. and that it rebels against God. Jeremiah 17:9, which I have the reference there, says that the heart is deceitful above all things and it's desperately wicked. That applies to every person that's ever been born. And that needs to be um, remedied. There needs to be a cure for that. And that's what's coming through the seed of the woman. Satan becomes man's master at this point. Man becomes a slave of Satan. People don't like to admit that, but that's what happened. That's where we're at right now. Also, when man rebelled, the world was legally handed over to Satan. And this is why over in John chapter 12, verse 31, that Christ himself says of Satan that he is ruler, the ruler of this world. That's what Christ calls him, the ruler of this world. So, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 says this, and I will put enmity between you and the woman. That word enmity means a deep-seated um, hatred, a mutual hatred between both the seeds. And he goes on to say, he shall do what? He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So this sets up what is known as the first reference to the gospel. What is coming? What is coming? It's a prophecy. Man's eventually going to destroy the serpent, through the cross, and that's a prophecy of what's coming through Christ. The victory is the ultimate seed, who is Jesus, the Messiah. When he comes into the world, dies on the cross, that's the wounding of the head, but it's not complete. It reduces Satan's power to a certain extent, but Satan is still in charge of this world that we're in. You can see my last bullet there, that most interpreters believe that this chapter 3, verse 17 of Genesis, is the first biblical promise of the provision of salvation. That means that's coming. The gospel is what's coming. And it was mentioned all the ways back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. He, in one of the commentaries that I've used in this study, the commentator states this. This is a major but partial fulfillment was the crucifixion and the resurrection of the Messiah. The Messiah, his heels were wounded by the nails on the cross. And Satan was bruised in the sense that his power was drastically or dramatically weakened. But the final, and this is what's important, the final crushing of the head of Satan will not take place until the future. And it's going to be accomplished when Satan is finally thrown into the lake of fire for all eternity. That's not going to happen anytime soon. We have, and what I've taught in the past is that we've got, the tribulation period that's going to come, and then we have the 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth. At the end of that 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth, that's when Satan is finally going to be thrown into the lake of fire, and that's coming for him, and he knows it's coming for him. So, what is his intent? His intent is to try to stop the seed of the woman from coming into the world. And how is he going to do this? Well, that's what most of our Old Testament is all about. And we can go all the ways back to the story of Cain and Abel. Now, one of the things we're going to be looking at several examples of Satan's attempt to stop the seed of the woman by coming into the world. But just understand that each of these examples that I'm giving, I mean, we could spend the whole Bible study on each of these. We just don't have time here. Maybe it might be something for you to do on your own. So we'll leave that up to you. But Satan's first attempt, of course, was by having Cain kill his brother Abel. But guess what? Adam and Eve had another son. His name was Seth. And it is through his line, that the Messiah will come. Again, all the ways back in Genesis chapter, the first part of Genesis, chapter 4 is where we have the story of Cain and Abel. So, um, another thing that takes place in our Old Testament, another attempt by Satan to stop the seed of the woman, is Pharaoh's persecution of the children of Israel while they were slaves in Egypt. If you recall in Exodus chapter 1, that's where Satan basically gives the law that says, any male child that's born to a Hebrew family is to be cast into the Nile River. And of course, that doesn't happen because two midwives who were delivering the babies had ways of getting around Pharaoh's in law at that point. So again, an attempt by Satan to stop the seed of the woman. How? Well, all we got to do is get rid of all the men, and that will. And again, by this time, Israel is a nation within a nation. They're a nation within Egypt at this point. So a lot of history goes by, and again, I'm just trying to pick select ones here. Over in Second Chronicles, chapters 22 and 23, we have a story that takes place concerning see if I can get this all here on one screen. Um, Concerning one of the kings of Israel. His name was Ahaziah. His mother's name was Athaliah. And her son Ahaziah is king. He's killed in a battle, and she decides to declare herself queen over all of Israel. Not only does she do that, but she actually has all of the royal offspring killed. Now, again, you need to go back and read the story there in Second Chronicles 22 and 23. It's a very interesting story. Long story short, there's one child that she misses. His name is Joash. He's actually going to be hidden in the temple for 6 years. He is the last of the royal line. He's the last heir of the tribe of Judah, and he's also not only the last from the tribe of Judah, but he's also of the house of David. That's the messianic line, and that's what's key about this story. Most people read this story and they really don't dig a little bit deeper. You need to understand this is Satan's attempt to wipe out the messianic line. And he uses this wicked woman here, Athaliah, to try and do so. Fast forward 6 years, the priest at that time was Jehoiada, and he eventually has Joash crowned as king. His grandmother will be put to death. And that's how the line is protected at that point. We go forward a few more years. This takes place after the 70-year captivity. We have the book of Esther. Most of you know the book of Esther. This evil fellow by the name of Haman wants to wipe out all of the Jews throughout the land. and he comes up with this scheme. Basically, he dupes the king into agreeing to it. And if you haven't read Esther in a while, it might be worth reading this summer. But she saves the nation of Israel from this evil individual by the name of Haman. Again, another attempt to wipe out the seed of the woman. Now, during the period between what we know as our Old Testament and our New Testament, that period is called the intertestamental period. It's the time period between the Old and the New Testament. And for charts, I love this because I can see. I'm a visual learner. This makes sense to me. These are known as the silent years. During these years, God is not speaking to Israel. No prophets are coming forward. Nobody is for the most part leading at this point. These are 400 years of silence. But there are things happening around the world, and especially in the ancient Middle East. The biggest thing is that Alexander the Great comes into power. He comes into power, and the world is now ruled by Greece. And he conquers from one end to the other end of the ancient Mid East. And after his death, uh, his um, his kingdom is divided into four sections. Four of his generals take over. One of the generals that takes over the area of the Middle East, and that would include um, Israel, is a fellow by the name of Antiochus the Great. Now he's just the one that gets things started. What happens is his one of his sons by the name of Antiochus the Fourth, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, you may have heard that, is actually prophesied in the book of Daniel. Well, he takes over this area of Israel, and he's going to turn Israel into Greece. He outlaws the speaking and writing of Hebrew. He sets up in the temple an idol of himself that's supposed to be worshipped. He goes as far as to sacrifice, and listen to this, sacrifice a pig, an unclean animal to the Jews on the altar in the temple. So, he is actually a type of the Antichrist that will be coming in the last days. As a matter of fact, in Matthew chapter 24, I think it's around verse 15, Christ even says that, uses the same language that Daniel does. You can see my reference up on the screen there, um, of calling him the abomination of desolation. In other words, when he comes, he's going to desolate the um, the temple, just like Antiochus the Fourth did back in about 200 BC. So again, another attempt to, and this time he wants to change all of Israel. That, of course, doesn't happen. Um, a group known as the Maccabees will rise up and overthrow him, and there's some great history there that's worth understanding. Again, this is not in our Bible. This is the intertestamental period. Um, we fast forward finally to the New Testament, and most of us know the story of Christmas when Christ comes into the world, and we know this evil king by the name of Herod the Great is on the throne. And of course, he finds out that the so-called king of Israel, the king of Israel, has come into the world, and he wants to know where. His wise men tell him, as well as the other wise men that come from the east, in Bethlehem is where this child's going to be born. And we know the story. He has all the children under the age, I believe it's the age of 2, all the male children put to death. But again, Mary, Joseph are warned to basically beat feet and get to Egypt and hang out there until this madman Herod the Great is off the throne, and that's what they do. So you can see, and of course, this is just a few of the examples that you can find through the Old Testament. There's many more, but this just kind of gives us an idea that Satan has always been trying to stop the seed of the woman from coming into the world. If he can do that, then there'll be no hope of salvation for mankind. So we've only looked at a few of these attempts by him to wipe out the seed, and that never happened. The seed does come into the world, and we know the rest of the story through the Gospels. But going back to Genesis chapter 6 now, the question at the bottom of the screen there, what was Satan's strategy for using fallen angels to accomplish this? So, as Paul Harvey used to say many years ago, now we get to hear the rest of the story. Well, this is the rest of the story. And again, there is there are people on both sides of this, what I'm going to be sharing with you. And I'm not saying that this is gospel truth. Of course, it's not. But this helps us, I think, understand Satan's strategy. Why would he do something like having his fallen demons, have children with women? One of the theories that's out there, and it makes sense when you think about it. Again, this is just something for you to think about, and give it some thought. I'm going to read this. It's worth reading and listening to. It says that what Satan was attempting to do was to corrupt the human gene pool by sending some of his fallen angels to take human wives and father offspring with them. The goal was to create a mixed, partially angelic, partially human race. We call them the Nephilim. That's Genesis 6, verse 4. So that the Messiah, born of the woman, could not be born fully human. And thus the promised seed that's going to come and crush his head of Genesis 3:15 would be neutralized. This was a deliberate, power-driven attempt to short-circuit God's plan for the Redeemer. Now, you may or may not have ever heard anything like this, but it's worth thinking about. There are a lot of scholars out there that hold this view. Might not be the most popular one out there, but it's something to at least consider. It makes sense when you understand, especially next week when we look at some of the New Testament verses that go along with this whole idea here. In the book that I've recommended several times to you by Dr. Mark Hitchcock on Satan, demons, and spiritual warfare, he says something similar. Look what he says in his book. He says that's why the flood was necessary, to preserve the human race intact, uncontaminated by Satan's scheme. By destroying the contaminated race and preserving uncontaminated Noah and his family, the way of redemption and coming of the Redeemer was preserved. The flood was a cataclysmic judgment, but it was also, listen to this, it was also an act of matchless grace, the matchless grace of God, to make sure that the plan of salvation stayed on track. That's good. I like the way Hitchcock puts this. It makes sense to me. When you see what the angels were doing, the fallen angels were doing, where Satan's strategy comes into play, and why, as we'll see next week, why there was such a dramatic and drastic judgment of these angelic beings. So, with that, let me just kind of remind you again that next week we're going to go to our New Testament. And we're going to see that God has bound these fallen angels in chains in the deepest, darkest parts of what's known as Hades, so that this heinous act that was committed here in Genesis chapter 6 could never be committed again. So, something for you to think about over this next week before we get to our next lesson. We have to keep in mind, and brought this out in a class that I just taught over the last day or two, that we're living in a fallen world. It's not perfect by any means, and it won't be until the Lord comes back. It won't be. So, are there, I guess, for lack of a better term, genetic mutations out there? Yeah, there are. Most of the time, they're pretty bad. They're pretty bad, but that can account for the people that we have documented. That are 7, 8, 9 feet in height. Um, they're giants from those of us that are 5'6", but again, they're not the Nephilim that ruled the earth in Genesis chapter 6 and were eventually totally wiped out. So think about that over this next week. Next time we get together, we'll be in the New Testament, and between now and then, God bless you, and hope you'll come back and watch the wrap up of this whole study on angels, Satan, and demons.